Easier if I turn on my mic. Good evening, everyone. My name is Alex Friedman. I am a first-year rabbinical student at Jewish Theological Seminary, and it is my pleasure and delight to play host for tonight's learning. Tonight's session is the fourth in our current four-part series on Israel and Zionism. This series is part of a collaborative effort with teachers representing JTS, Ziegler, Schechter, and the RA. This series re-examines some of Zionism's key ideas, moments, and challenges from its earliest origins and into the 21st century. Tonight's title is Sovereignty and the Dilemmas of Power, and we will be ably taught by Rabbi Lauren Berkun, who is a vice president of the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America, where she directs rabbinic initiatives and is a member of the senior executive team. She also oversees staff education, training, and curriculum development for Hartman's iEngage project. She is a summa cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Princeton University with a BA in religion and was ordained at the Jewish Theological Seminary. Lauren was a Wexner Graduate Fellow, a Klal Rabbinic Intern, and a Rabbinic Fellow in the Shalom Hartman Institute's Rabbinic Leadership Initiative. She has also served as the JTS Midwest Kolot Rabbinic Scholar, Director of Lifelong Learning at Congregation Shaare Zedek in Southfield, Michigan, and a frequent scholar and resident for leadership seminars at Jewish federations across North America. Rabbi Berkun has written and taught extensively on the topics of mikveh, sexual ethics, and body image. She also lives in Aventura, Florida, with her husband, Rabbi Jonathan Berkun of Aventura Turnberry Jewish Center, and their 3 children. There will be an opportunity at the end of tonight's session for Q&A. Please send me your questions via the chat. I will look through them and address some of them to Rabbi Berkun at the end. I will also be sending out a link momentarily to the source sheet for those of you who are asking. But without further ado, Rabbi Lauren Berkun.
Thank you so much, Alex. It's wonderful to be with all of you. And it is, I think, one of the blessings of this COVID era, almost post-COVID era, God willing, that we have learned how to connect across space and time, and that we have prioritized partnerships and collaborations to bring people together and to share our learning. And I'm just thrilled to be with you tonight. And I will admit that when I was first invited to teach in this series, I thought about some of the Torah I've been focusing on a lot these days at the Shalom Hartman Institute in my work with rabbis and with lay leaders around Jewish peoplehood and the relationship between diaspora Jews and Israel, some of the challenges around pluralism in this moment of polarization. And I will tell you that yesterday, as we were watching the events in Israel unfold, I felt that I really needed to speak about the moment and to bring hopefully some Torah that can help us from afar think about the challenges and the dilemmas that Israel is facing, and how we as diaspora Jews can be partners with Israel in this era of Jewish sovereignty. And I will say that when we think about the challenges that face the Jewish people in the era of Jewish sovereignty, one of the greatest challenges is how do we struggle with Jewish power? For thousands of years, as we lived in exile, where we did not have to dirty our hands with the day-to-day challenges of statehood, we faced the vulnerabilities and the dangers of not controlling our own destiny and not being able to defend ourselves. But in some ways, we also were able to avoid those moral challenges that face a nation that wields power. And one of the greatest sources of tension and conflict in the relationship with Israel for world Jewry over the past decades has been this question of how the modern state of Israel wields power and wields military power. And what I want to explore with you this evening is how we can shape a Jewish values-based conversation about Jewish power in the modern era, where we do indeed have our own nation state, and we have an army, and we face wars and the need to fight against terrorism. And I want to share some broad text-based ideas rooted in classical Jewish sources to begin our evening, to try to lay out a case for how we might speak about Jewish power as a value. And then I want to turn to the situation in the streets of Israel today and think about how an Israeli army faces the moral dilemmas of fighting against a terrorist enemy, and the specifically the code of ethics of the IDF, and how the Israeli army endeavors to incorporate moral values into its military exercises, and whether or not it always lives up to its ideals, to examine what it has set out as its moral aspirations as an army. And I hope by the end of my seminar this evening, we will have some new language to speak about what's happening right now in Israel, not just the policy debates that often divide our community, but hopefully some shared sources, texts, ideas, and values that can help us speak with one another, no matter what our politics may be on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and on the specific situation on the ground at any moment in Israel. And what I have found over the years in working with rabbis and with synagogue communities and learners is that when we can transcend the Israel conversation beyond just our policy debates, but we can attempt to delve more deeply and excavate what are the Jewish values, and how do we understand our Jewish identity, our relationship with Israel based on our moral aspirations, based on our deep-rooted Jewish teachings and Torah. We're able to have more civil, healthy conversations with one another, even as we are living in communities that will always have a spectrum of ideas politically. And that's part of the Jewish people. That's part of the diversity and I think the beauty of Jewish pluralism and peoplehood, that we will have a diversity of views. But can we come together as a community around a shared values conversation? So I want to just dive in and begin that kind of conversation when it comes to this question of how we think about Jewish power, and specifically the question of self-defense and self-preservation. And I want to share a source sheet, and I'll probably speak for a good 30, maybe even 40 minutes laying out a case, a narrative about Jewish power. And then I would love to hear through your questions some of your reactions and how these sources and these ideas can be helpful to you in this moment. So I want to begin with the question of whether power is inherently corrupting, because that's often one of the critiques of whether it's Israel or any nation state in their use of power, that power is corrupting. And power is and the use of power is somehow morally tainted and dirties our hands. When we know that any nation state, if we want to be in the business of having a Jewish homeland that is a nation state, we can't avoid the use of power. And what I want to argue from the outset is that the Torah, from its very first chapter, teaches us that power is not a corrupting force, but power is actually a gift from God in creation to humanity, and is from the outset meant to be part of the very meaning and purpose of human life. So if you look at the very first chapter of the Torah in Genesis 1, God says, let us make Ha'adam, let us make humans in our image, after our likeness. They shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, and all the creeping things that creep on earth. And God created the human in the divine image. In the image of God, humans were created, male and female. God created them, God blessed them, and God said to them, be fertile and increase, fill the earth and master it, rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and all the living things that creep on earth. So what we learn in the creation story, first of all, is that human beings are created in the divine image. Human life has sacred value, infinite worth, and human life has meaning and purpose, that we are created to be partners with God in creation, to be rulers, to be masters, to take our power as human beings in the divine image, to do things in the world. And as Jewish theology will unfold, particularly in rabbinic thought and beyond, what we learn is that God creates humans in the divine image so that humans can be partners with God, can be agents in the world for tikkun, for repairing the world, for partnering with God and completing creation, because the world is not created perfect. It is an unfolding creation, and it is through human power and action that we can bring about tikkun in the world. So human life has sacred value and infinite worth, and therefore we have to take human life extremely seriously. And we'll talk in a moment about what that means regarding self-preservation and self-defense. But one of the first things we learn out of this teaching of Tselem Elohim, that human life has sacred value and is in the divine image, is that taking human life or murder is tantamount to destroying the divine image. And we learn in Genesis 9 that anyone who sheds the blood of a human being, the penalty is death, because taking a human life is taking I want to say a mini divine in the world, a walking image of God in the world. We are to take killing extremely seriously. And I'm trying to scroll down here and my computer's frozen for a moment. Let's fix that. Okay, there we go. So when we think about the modern exercise of power, particularly in war, one of the greatest challenges in the morality of war or the morality of self-defense is this question of killing versus murder. And when can you take human life? Is it ever possible to take human life? And one of the things that the Jewish tradition teaches us over and over again is not only is human life sacred because every human being is created in the divine image, but I am sacred because I am created in the divine image. And therefore, I have a moral obligation to save my own life and to protect myself. And as we'll see in a minute, I might even say I have a moral obligation to first and foremost defend my own life, because I am myself a walking image of God who has a mission and purpose in the world to be an agent for God in the world. And that is perhaps why I'm sorry, my computer is freezing here. That is perhaps why in Leviticus 19, in that famous expression, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha," you shall love your neighbor as yourself, ani Hashem. Love your neighbor as yourself. What we learn from this edict is not just that we should love and care for other people, but we have to love ourselves. Caring for yourself is part of how we become moral agents in the world. And how that is translated through Jewish law is that we first have to protect our lives and do whatever we can do to stay alive and to defend our own lives before we can then turn to the world and care for others and repair the world and do all that great work as walking images of God in the world. And there is a Talmudic story that expresses that moral teaching most vividly, and it's a story in Tractate Baba Metzia in the Talmud. And I'm going to work through some of these sources relatively quickly to lay out these ideas, but there's certainly a lot to unpack in this little story. If two are traveling on a journey far from civilization, so they're in the middle of a desert, and one has a pitcher of water, if both drink, they will both die. But if only one drinks, he or she can reach civilization and survive. The son of Keturah taught it's better that they should share the pitcher of water, even though it's not enough to get them through the desert. And even if they'll both die, at least they're sharing the water. And that's better, because rather than one should behold the friend's death, better to share the water than to see your fellow that you're traveling with succumb to thirst and die. But Rabbi Akiva comes along and says, "V'chai achicha imach," that your kin may live with you. This is taken from Leviticus 25. Chayecha kodmim lechaye chavercha. This teaches you that your life takes precedence over the life of your friend. Your life comes first. So according to Rabbi Akiva, if you're stranded in a desert and you are holding onto a pitcher of water that would be enough water to sustain you so that you could survive until you reach the next city, you should drink all that water, keep it all to yourself. Don't give sips of it to your friend. Now, that may seem horribly callous, but what we learn from this dramatic, terrible story is that the preservation of human life is a Jewish value. It's actually a mitzvah, it's an obligation. And when you can save your life, you must save your life. Now, notice that it says you have the water, you're holding the water. It doesn't say if you're walking through the desert and your friend has water that you should knock him over and steal it from him. No, the idea is if you have the ability yourself with your own resources to sustain your life, that's your first priority, and it must be your first priority. Stemming from that same teaching that my life has value, saving my life is an obligation and a mitzvah because my life is in the image of God, and it's better for me to survive than for me and my friend both to die, even though it seems more compassionate. We move on to Bamidbar Rabbah, which is a midrash on the book of Numbers, where we learn in Numbers 25 that the Israelites are taught to harass the Midianites. Why? Because they harass you. From this, the sages have derived the maxim, Ba lahargecha, hashkem lahargo. If a person comes to kill you, you should kill them first. This is the very clear teaching of self-defense. If someone is coming to attack you, you may kill them, and that is not considered murder, as we learned up on the first page in Genesis 9, that you can't take a human life, you can't murder, or you yourself will be subject to capital punishment. No, if someone is coming to kill you, they forfeit their right to life, and you are obligated to kill them first and to preserve your life. This is the law of self-defense. And what we have laid out very quickly, I realize, but what we've laid out from these basic classic Jewish sources about the value of life, the mitzvah to preserve your own life, to keep yourself alive, and the right to rise up in self-defense if someone is coming to kill you, is a lot about self-preservation and the mitzvah of self-defense. And the question that it then begs is, are there limits? And what I would say is, while Judaism teaches us, starting in the first chapter of the Torah itself, about the value of human life and eventually the value of self-defense and self-preservation, it is also very clear that that value of protecting yourself and staying alive has limits. That we don't stay alive no matter what we might have to do. But there are guidelines and limits about this. And one of the best sources for this is, again, in the Talmud, here in Tractate Sanhedrin, that stems first from a principle that many of you may have heard of called Pikuach Nefesh. And I'll start here. Rabbi Yochanan said, I'm on source 6. Rabbi Yochanan said, in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yechod Tzadok, by a majority vote, it was resolved in the upper chambers of the house of Nitzah in Lod, that for every law in the Torah, if one is commanded transgress or be killed, they may transgress so as not to be killed, except for 3 things: idolatry, sexual abomination, and murder. So here we have that principle that your life is so valuable that you are not only permitted, but you are obligated to violate Torah in order to save your life. So if someone is holding a gun to your head and says, eat this piece of pig or I will shoot you, you eat the piece of pig. However, that principle, that Jewish law and Torah is meant to sustain life, and that if observing Torah would endanger your life, then you are obligated to violate the Torah. It also has exceptions. It also has limits. And in this case, there are 3 exceptions: idolatry, sexual abomination, and murder. And I just tonight want to focus on murder because it's most relevant to our contemporary case about self-defense. So let's talk about murder. How do we know this of murder? Well, according to the Talmud, it's common sense. If someone comes before you, or someone actually posed this question to Rabbi, an important rabbi, and said to him, the governor of my town has ordered me, go and kill so-and-so. If not, I will slay you. So Rabbi answers, let him slay you rather than you shall commit murder. Who knows that your blood is redder? Perhaps his blood is redder. This principle of whose blood is redder, this is an essential component of Jewish ethics around the ethical use of power and the limits of self-preservation and self-defense. Yes, your life is sacred. Yes, you must do all you can to stay alive, even if it sometimes means violating Torah. But if someone were to say, murder your neighbor or I will shoot you in the head, you cannot become a murderer in order to stay alive yourself, because then is your life worth living? Are there things that you could do, whether it's idolatry, sexual abomination, or murder, that would make your life no longer worth living? And in this case also, we see the essential aspect that not only does life have infinite value, but all human life is equal. It's infinite in value, but it's also each human life is unique. Every human being is a unique walking image of God. And who is to say that my human life is more important than your human life? So that's another important idea to keep in mind when we start to think about the ethical use of power. And the last thing I will say before we turn to our modern dilemmas around the state of Israel and its use of military power is a wonderful midrash in Bereshit Rabbah, which speaks about that moment when Jacob is about to meet with his brother Esau. And if you remember the story in the book of Genesis, he is afraid. He hasn't seen his brother Esau in years. And the last time he saw Esau, Esau had a murderous rage and wanted to kill him because he had stolen the birthright. And so Jacob goes off for decades and leaves town to escape his murderous brother. And now he's coming back and wants to reconcile with him, but isn't sure what will meet him when he greets Esau. And it says in that moment before the reunion, Vayira Yaakov me'od vayetzer lo. Jacob was greatly afraid and was distressed. Now that phrase in the Torah is redundant. Why doesn't it just say Jacob was afraid? Why does it say he was afraid and troubled? He was afraid and distressed. The rabbis, when they see repetitions in the Torah, always use it as a springboard for commentary, and this is their remarkable commentary. Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rabbi Eli, isn't fear and distress the same thing? Why does the Torah have to tell us both? Rather, the meaning is Yirah shelo yaharog v'yetzer lo shelo yehareg. So he was afraid lest he should be killed by Esau, who might still hate him and want to murder him. And he was distressed lest he have to kill in self-defense. And that, I think, is a wonderful expression of the ambivalence that we should feel in wielding power, especially when it comes to taking life. And that ambivalence is a moral virtue. And the lesson is essentially when we have to use power, when we have to take life, we should be greatly conflicted about it. And that, I think, leads us directly into our conversation for the evening, which is the terrible situation that Israel faces and has faced throughout its history in its wars, particularly in the last few decades in its wars against a terrorist enemy. And I want to spend a little bit of time with you speaking about the moral aspirations of the IDF Code of Ethics and maybe how it can help us think about our relationship with Israel and the dilemmas that we see playing out often in our communal conversations and in the media about Israel's use of power. Because often the debates around Israel's use of power either circle around Israel is overusing power or Israel is not using enough power. And the first thing I want to say about the IDF Code of Ethics, which was in part co-authored by a longstanding Hartman Institute colleague and scholar, Professor Moshe Halbertal, who's also a professor of law at NYU and a professor of philosophy and Talmud at Hebrew University. And he worked with several other philosophers and ethicists to draft this version of the IDF Code of Ethics in the early 2000s. And the first thing I'll point out about it is the very mission of the IDF. The IDF mission is to defend the existence, territorial integrity, and sovereignty of the State of Israel, to protect the inhabitants of Israel, and to combat all forms of terrorism which threaten the daily life. So right off the bat, and I've just given you on your source sheet some excerpts. You can find the IDF Code of Ethics. If you Google it, IDF has a website in English and you'll see the full Code of Ethics. It's relatively long. But the first thing to point out is that even in the name IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, it starts with the idea that an army, an ethical Jewish army of a Jewish state, should be about defense. Any wars that Israel has to embark upon are wars of self-defense. And part of the challenge of a modern nation in war is to know when going to war is a just war. And a war of defense is always a just war if a state is being attacked. Defending the citizens and defending the inhabitants against all forms of terrorism or attack against their population is an obligation of any nation. So that's automatically a just war. But the greater challenge for Israel in its wars throughout the last few decades has been morality in war. Once you have to engage in a war against an enemy or against a terrorist threat, how do you make sure that in the midst of that exercise of power, you are still living up to the values that you have set out for yourself? And you'll see that in the spirit of the IDF, it draws on four sources: the tradition of the IDF and its military heritage as the Israel Defense Forces, the tradition of the State of Israel, its democratic principles, laws, and institutions, the tradition of the Jewish people throughout their history, and universal moral values based on the value and dignity of human life. So what's interesting in the IDF Code of Ethics is that it is transparent about the different ways in which it is drawing on moral values to set out its aspirations for itself. The military heritage of the IDF, democratic principles, Jewish traditions and Jewish values, and the universal moral values of human dignity and human life, which is a recurring theme throughout the Code of Ethics. You'll see here in the bottom, I'm just going to highlight it. If you see here, human dignity, the IDF and its soldiers are obligated to protect human dignity. Every human being is of value, regardless of his or her origin, religion, nationality, gender, status, or position. And then going on, human life, the IDF service men and women will act in a judicious and safe manner in all they do out of recognition of the supreme value of human life. During combat, they will endanger themselves and their comrades only to the extent required to carry out their mission. And you can almost hear it in the background of these two sections, human dignity and human life, echoes from the Torah itself. All human life has value. Everyone is created in the image of God, regardless of religion, nationality, gender, status. And so every human life has dignity. The IDF will aspire in its moral training of its soldiers to ensure to the best of their ability that soldiers take into account human dignity in all their interactions with every human being, but also that they will do what they can to protect their own life. And that's the mitzvah, the obligation to preserve your own life. Now, the final part that I want to focus on before we open it up for conversation is what is called the purity of arms. And before I read the purity of arms with you and kind of unpack it with you, I want to share some teachings from Moshe Halbertal, who has spoken, and you can Google, there are many different lecture versions of this talk and even article versions, one, The Moral Challenges in Asymmetric Warfare. It's a very useful outline of both the challenges that Israel faces in its wars against a terrorist enemy and its calculations and how it makes its decisions when it exercises power, how it makes its determinations around self-defense and when to engage. And let me just stop sharing for a second so that you're not constantly looking at a screen. So let me give a little bit of background before we go into the purity of arms, which is the section of the IDF Code of Ethics around use of power. So what Moshe Halbertal explains, and he was the respondent to the Goldstone report after the last Gaza war, he explains that since the beginning of the 1990s, that Israel has been facing a really different set of military challenges, and it has posed both strategic questions and a whole new set of moral challenges. And this, to describe the situation, he uses the term asymmetric war. And this is a war where the two classical features of war have been erased. One classical feature of war is uniforms, where each side distinguishes itself from its environment by wearing uniforms. And the second is a front, a war front, where combatants engage in battle on a battlefield. And the challenge that Israel has faced in its wars with Hamas and with other terrorist enemies is that it is a war without uniforms, where the enemy does not distinguish themselves from the civilian population in which they live. And it's a war without a front, in the sense that the enemy is targeting the entire civilian population. And that erasure of those two central features of a traditional war is meant by the enemy to cause terror and panic, and also meant by the enemy to cause an overreaction on the part of Israel, and which will both galvanize and radicalize the enemy population, and also will create world criticism against Israel in its reactions. And we've seen this cycle after cycle in all of these waves with Gaza, but the internal dilemmas that Israel faces in these questions is what do we do given this new condition of warfare against a terrorist enemy that will indiscriminately target the entire civilian population and will not distinguish themselves from the civilians? How do you fight against such an enemy? And as Halbertal explains, there's two moral and political solutions that are often posed, both of which are problematic. One position that is posed, we might call this a radical right-wing position, is to say, well, the other side's hiding within a civilian population and the other side is targeting our civilians. So they are the ones to blame if their civilians are killed. That's their problem. That's not our problem. So you'll hear this in certain cases, like just bomb all of Gaza and turn it into a parking lot. It's a perverse response, but it's on some level an understandable response from that logic of we are not the ones morally responsible. The enemy is the ones morally responsible. That's not a possible position for a moral army, of course, but neither is the radical left-wing position, which may say that if there is a war in which innocent civilians might be killed, you have to refuse to fight it. There's no way to engage morally in a war where there might be collateral killing of civilians. So that's also an impossible position because a nation is responsible to defend its citizens. And we saw that the IDF is Israel's defense force. Every nation state is, its primary obligation is to protect and defend its citizens against aggression. And the question is, how do you do that once you're engaging in a moral war, in a just war? How do you do that in war in as moral a way as possible, keeping in mind that some innocent civilians may be killed? And we don't like to call this collateral damage. We call this collateral killing because it is killing. But as we saw earlier in our classical Jewish sources, there is a distinction between killing and murder. And this is what I want to unpack with you now by looking at the principles that are laid out in the purity of arms of the IDF. On this question of how can we use force when we do have to engage in a just war, how do we do it as morally as possible? And these are the principles. The IDF servicemen and women will use their weapons and force only for the purpose of their mission, only to the necessary extent, and will maintain their humanity even during combat. IDF soldiers will not use their weapons and force to harm human beings who are not combatants or prisoners of war, and will do all in their power to avoid causing harm to their lives, bodies, dignity, and property. So out of this purity of arms, which was carefully crafted by the authors of the Code of Ethics for the IDF, are four main principles that we'll unpack: the principle of necessity, distinction, avoidance, and proportionality. And the idea here is when you are training an army of soldiers who may have to engage on the ground in moral decision-making in the moment, in micro wars, where it's not just, you know, someone in a high tower at a high government position deciding whether to send a huge bomb somewhere, but on the ground, often against a terrorist enemy, soldiers at all different levels of command have to make moral calculations about whether to shoot, what size of artillery to use, whether someone that they are defending themselves against is actually a combatant or not a combatant. So, so as the Code of Ethics tries to train them in just thinking, going through automatically these four questions about their engagement with power. One is the principle of necessity. Is my use of the gun or the rocket in this moment necessary to my mission? And it's simple and basic. If you have to destroy something in a house for the defense and security of your citizenship, you can't also break the TV on the way out of the door. There's a continuum between professionalism and morality. You can only use your firepower for your mission, and you can't collect debts with your guns. You can't, the weapon is there for you to protect the state and not to exact revenge. So that's a first and basic principle. Do I need to use my gun? Is it necessary to protect the state? And the second is the principle of distinction. And this becomes very difficult in a war against an enemy that does not wear a uniform and that embeds itself in a civilian population. Am I training my weapon and using my power against a combatant or not? There is no circumstance in which the IDF army can use weapons against innocent civilians, even if it would help their mission. So principle number one, only use your weapons for necessity to fulfill your mission. Principle number two of distinction modifies principle number one. Even if it might help your mission to tell a terrorist, if you shoot a rocket into southern Israel, I will kill your entire family. Maybe that would be a deterrent, but it wouldn't be an ethical use of power, and it wouldn't be permitted by the Code of Ethics of the IDF. So this principle limits the principle of necessity, and we distinguish between killing and murder. Anytime you use a weapon against an innocent civilian, that's murder. The problem, of course, in an asymmetrical war is how do you define a combatant? How do you decide who is a legitimate target? And part of the question is around the causal chain that ends up threatening and harming Israeli civilians and soldiers. So if you are the bomb maker, you're part of that causal chain. If you are the driver that's bringing the bomb, knowingly bringing the bomb to the site, you're part of that causal chain. If you are a taxi driver who doesn't know the person in the back is carrying a weapon in their backpack, you are not part of that causal chain. So these are all part of the complexity of fighting in these kinds of war. And of course, it doesn't mean that the IDF soldiers don't individually sometimes violate this. In warfare, we have crimes like in every army, including the American Army. But as a policy, the IDF is very clear, and in its training of soldiers, that, that the training of a weapon can only be on a combatant. And the next principle, the next two principles are the principles that cause the greatest amount of controversy in Israel when this version of the Code of Ethics was authored, because there was an earlier version by Asa Kasher in the 1990s. It was replaced in the early 2000s by this version of the IDF Code of Ethics, and it included that purity of arms, the principles of avoidance and proportionality. The principles, and I'm just going to bring this back up for you again so you can see it in the language. The principle of avoidance and proportionality is right here. IDF soldiers will not use their weapons and force to harm human beings who are not combatants or prisoners of war, and will do all in their power to avoid causing harm to their lives, bodies, dignity, and property. So the principle of avoidance says that I will do everything that I can to avoid collateral killing, even at the risk of my own life. And this is what was controversial in Israel, because you could say, well, wait, the moral principles that I've just laid out in this whole Jewish conversation about use of power and the value of Tselem Elohim in human life is that my life takes precedence. I have to keep myself alive. I'm allowed to defend myself if someone is coming to kill me. That's all true. But we also read that you can't murder someone else, even if it would protect your own life. And as a result, there are times where you have to risk your own life and even lay down your own life rather than murder innocent life. And this is where for soldiers, it's very difficult. The idea that you have to go in, let's take Gaza as a great example. It's a lot easier for Israel to send in drones or to send rockets from Israel over into Gaza. But we know whenever we send in rockets, there's a greater risk of civilian casualties, because even with all the precisions and even with all of the warnings and the cell phones and the leaflets and the flyers that Israel will drop before it sends a bomb to try to avoid, to the best of their ability, civilian casualties, there are inevitably collateral killings that happen. So that's why sometimes armies make the horrible, horrific decision to send in ground troops, even though it will risk their soldiers, because that is the better way to avoid civilian casualties, is to send people on the ground where they can use smaller weapons, more targeted rockets, and to be able to get the coordinates and the locations of very specific targets on the ground. But that comes with a lot of risk to soldiers, and it is part of the principle of the IDF to assume risks upon themselves in order to avoid civilian casualty. And the last part here, the principle of proportionality, is to say when I am dropping that bomb or shooting in the direction of that sniper, is the expected benefit from that use of power proportionate with the possible and expected civilian casualties that might result from that use of power? And that's also part of the calculus. So if Israel is deciding to send in a rocket to take down an entire high-rise building because it is, let's say, as it's been reported in the news even as of yesterday, you know, a Hamas headquarters or a research and development site for developing rockets, Israel, as was reported even from sources in Gaza, Israel will send a roof knocking missile first. Those are missiles that land on the roof of buildings and send a loud shake and a boom without destroying the building. That's to scare any humans that are in the building to run out. There's also reports that they will call the managers of the building to try to negotiate with them how long it will take them to evacuate citizens from the buildings before they will bomb and destroy a building. These are all examples of the principle of avoidance. But in cases where they're not able to do that, the question is my expected outcome from sending that missile proportionate in terms of carrying out my mission to defend the state of Israel, to defend my citizens, even if it will result in civilian casualties? And that's where the calculus is very difficult. And how the Israeli army or commanders make those decisions is very nuanced. Is it, you know, one Hamas commander for how many innocent civilian lives? And in general, the IDF strives to avoid civilian life at all costs, even if it means that they can't take out a high-level Hamas commander, as an example, and that's happened often over the last few decades. And this is, these are impossible questions, but questions that every moral army has to ask of itself. And I wanted to just share with you a little bit of kind of an inside look at how the Israeli army, through this code of ethics and purity of arms, tries to train its soldiers to think in these ways, to think about how they use power. Is this necessary to protect and defend our citizens? Am I making sure not to target innocent non-combatants? Am I avoiding, to the best of my abilities, civilian casualties, even at risk to my own life? And when I have to use power, will that amount of power be proportionate with the potential risk to civilian casualties? So I want to stop at this point. And what I hope I've laid out is both some of the dilemmas that Israel faces, that the Jewish people face now that we're living in an era of sovereignty where we have a nation to defend, we have an army, we have the ability now in ways maybe we never did for thousands of years to protect our own lives and recognize that our lives are a gift from God, in the image of God, that we have work to do in this world. We have aspirations as a people of exceptionalism to do our work in Tikkun Olam and building just and moral societies. And that's all part of saving our lives, keeping ourselves alive, defending ourselves. But at the same time, we have to engage in wars that risk us using power in ways that can kill innocent life. And that is a horrible dilemma to be in. We fear lest we will be killed by those who want to destroy us, and we fear lest we have to kill. And that ambivalence and that dilemma, I think, sits with Israel very hard in these very moments as we speak. And I'm going to open it up now for some of your questions and your responses, and see, I hope that some of these sources were helpful to you.
Hi, Rabbi Berkun. It is a real pleasure to get to learn from you this evening. I have a few questions, and I also suspect folks will start sending them in to me as you answer. David and Bruce ask, what does the Jewish tradition have to say about preemptive attacks? Thinking, for example, about Iran's nuclear program, or even attacks that are going on right now.
Yeah, that is a really good question. There's another good source I didn't bring about, there's classical sources that talk about this. I think that, yeah, and I think this is part of the calculus of any nation state that has a moral obligation to protect its citizens. And the question of intelligence, and when you know that there is a viable threat, an existential threat, and the decisions that are necessary to, to protect sometimes means preemptive strikes. We've seen Israel do this often using its extraordinary intelligence, using cyber warfare, which is obviously always preferable in these situations because it often avoids civilian casualties in large numbers. And that's part of the genius of the IDF in Israeli society and becoming so technologically advanced to be able to use its scientific power to protect its citizens and not only its military might. But I do think in the ethics of war, that part of morality in war involves also sometimes preemptive actions that are necessary to protect life.
Thank you. Jay asks, late night host Trevor Noah has posed the question, if you are in a fight where the other person cannot beat you, how hard should you retaliate when they try to hurt you?
Yeah, this is a great question. And actually, this is a question that was asked after the last Gaza war. And Moshe Halbertal talks about this a lot when we talk about, I want to get to my notes here so I can respond as best as possible. This is the question of necessity. How necessary is it to exert your power against an enemy? This is an asymmetric war, both because the other side is a terrorist enemy that has erased, as we said, the distinction between enemy and combatants and non-combatants by targeting an entire civilian population, and has erased the war front. So how do you respond? And what's frustrating sometimes in the media is that equation between life and life, which is an unfair equation. If you have a terrorist enemy that is sending rockets into a civilian population, it is the right within morality of war, morality in war, for a nation to defend its civilian population by responding to those terrorist threats, even if 100 terrorists are killed and only one citizen is killed. It's not fair to say 100 Gazans were killed and one Israeli was killed, as if that is to show that there was a disproportionate use of power. Because any amount of killing necessary for the enemy, I'm talking about combatants, I'm not talking about civilian casualties, I'm talking about enemies, any amount of killing is justifiable to prevent attacks on your civilian population. And the question is, in Israel's use of power against that threat and against those attacks, what is the mission? And this is the challenge in Gaza. If the mission is deterrence, for example, responding to rockets launched from Gaza in a way that will deter Hamas from sending more rockets, there's a certain amount of force that can be used as a deterrent. And then you can decide that the amount of force used was overkill, that it would have been enough of a deterrent for Israel only to, I don't know, I'm going to make this up, only to send 20, missiles back into Gaza, but they sent 40, and that was over the top, and it was an excessive use of power and force, and Israel should be held responsible for that immoral use of force. That's a possible argument if you're saying that the only mission is deterrence. But if the mission is to destroy Hamas, then you might argue the opposite. You might argue that the last Gaza war was not enough of an exercise of power because it did not fully finish the job of destroying Hamas. So it becomes very challenging to apply the morality of war principles in a case where it becomes very important to determine what your mission is, and then you can determine whether the amount of use of force was necessary or not. And I think the great tragedy and the challenge of this question of the balance of power between Israel with its world-class military and Hamas, who is a terrorist organization that, of course, does not have the same world-class military as Israel, but it is waging a terrorist battle against Israel. Israel can respond with force. I don't know if I'm answering that fully enough, but I think we have to be very clear about not making moral equivalencies in the two types of use of power. When Israel is responding in self-defense to protect its citizens, it cannot be weighed on the same level as Hamas sending rockets as a terrorist enemy to threaten and terrorize the Israeli population.
Thank you. Barbara asks, how do we weigh having the celebration of the Jerusalem Day March against the anger and passion it could and did raise?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it wasn't as much my focus tonight. I wanted to make sure to talk about the issues of the military ethics and the challenges of self-defense. But I think in a larger conversation about power and the challenges of sovereignty, this is also a really important question for Israel and for our moral aspirations. Part of being powerful is learning when not to exercise your power. And when is it important for a society to showcase its sovereignty and its power? And when is it important for it to to exercise other values in the community. I mean, I don't know how to say it more clearly, but I think you can kind of hear my own instincts coming through in this. I think there's obviously a spectrum of views, and I don't want to be too political. I'm sure everyone here tonight has a spectrum of views, but I think that yeah, I think this is it's a real challenge, and one of the greatest horrors about what is happening right now in Israeli society is the way in which the Arab-Israeli citizenship is in certain pockets erupting in violence in a way that really, really challenges the democratic values and aspirations of Israel, and some of its progress over the last few years in trying to achieve a greater equality in Israeli society for all citizens, regardless of religion and ethnicity, and a sense of Israeliness and citizenship for all of its population, not just Jewish Israelis. And part of that has been possible because of progress in coexistence and in lots of efforts to create communities where Arabs and Jews could live together. And it's terrifying to think that if Israeli sentiment shifts and begins to see the Arab-Israeli population as a fifth column and as an enemy within, it makes it much, much harder for Israel to continue doing the necessary work as a democratic society to build towards a citizenship where all citizens, Arabs, Israelis, Druze, Christians, Muslims, and Jews can have full equality. And I think that is, well, I won't say, I was gonna talk about Hamas's role in that, but I don't wanna, and it's also not my expertise to weigh in exactly on the policy implications here, but I think that it's a really terrifying moment. And I'm hearing from my colleagues in Israel and from colleagues who have really been heartbroken by what has been happening in the last few weeks around these questions in East Jerusalem and in challenges with the ongoing occupation and with the potential for a future two-state solution and for some sort of a peace in the future, that when things happen on the ground that make it more and more difficult for the Israeli majority to feel confidence in that process and to support that process, there's, I think, it's very distressing and disheartening, and I feel like that's an understatement, but I think that's the situation that I'm hearing from so many of my colleagues that are living in Israel right now.
I think we have time maybe for one more question. Lori and Eddie, I hope will both forgive me for rephrasing their question, but they asked similar ones. We're having kind of a higher discussion of aspirations and ethics and military conflict. I think they're both kind of wondering, as far as when the enemy doesn't have these kinds of discussions, and perhaps when these kinds of discussions do not kind of make their way into the world, what's the point? What's the point?
All right, that's a great way to end. But before, I wanted to ask, I saw that Jay had sent this question about if the other person can't beat you, how hard should you retaliate when they try to hurt you? And I don't think I answered fully, because what I wanted to say is part of the proportionality principle is that if you can stop your enemy from killing you by shooting them in the leg, and instead you shoot them in the heart, now you're guilty of murder. Because part of the principle of proportionality is that you can only use your weapon and your force as necessary for your mission, and only in a proportional way to achieve your mission. So I think that I missed that opportunity before to give that answer. So yes, you can use force to stop an enemy from coming to kill you, but only for the purpose of stopping them. This last question is, I think, the perfect way to end. And what I want to say about the hard work of Moshe Halbertal and his co-authors in the IDF Code of Ethics, and all those in Israel who are striving to live up to the aspirations, the moral aspirations of a Zionism that's about Jewish exceptionalism and about creating a moral society that can be a light unto the nations, is to say the following. The moral failures of your enemy does not remove your moral aspirations from the battlefield. You cannot say, because I'm fighting an immoral enemy that makes no distinction between a civilian and a combatant, then I too am free from having to make that distinction, and I can just rain down all the bombs on Gaza until everyone is dead, and then no one will come to hurt me anymore. Obviously, that is not a moral response, but even in a smaller way, it's a human instinct to say, they want to kill us, and you know what? They're the ones putting their civilians at harm's way, and why should I have to risk my life because of their immorality? And these are the questions that keep us up at night, keep us up, those who care about the safety and well-being of Israel, but also care about the mission of Israel. And there are two primary narratives, and this was the original topic for our evening, two primary narratives for world Jewry about the meaning of Israel. The meaning of Israel from the beginning, from the outset, not just modern state of Israel, but all the way back from the time of the Torah, has been about being normal and being safe, that we too need a home where we can defend ourselves and control our own destiny, and a place where we can be exceptional, where we can live up to our fullest aspirations as a light unto the nation and create a society of peace and justice. And what challenges us in these moments when we are faced with these impossible situations and these moral and ethical dilemmas is, how do we hold both simultaneously? How do we do what is necessary to keep ourselves safe and to do the moral obligation of a nation to protect its citizens against a terrorist threat and any threats from within, while at the same time fulfilling the purpose and the mission of Zionism, which is to be a Jewish people that can create a society that will live up to the values of our tradition and will be a model to the world of what it means to create a nation built on equality, the value of human life and dignity, justice. And this is our ongoing challenge as a Jewish people from the beginning of our journey, and it is our great challenge in these years of sovereignty. And I feel so blessed that we are living in this period of history, how blessed we are to be alive in this moment, but also the weight and the great stress I think we all feel in this moment of fear for the security and the safety of our brothers and sisters in Israel, and fear for all of the innocent human beings, Palestinians, Arab Israelis, and all who are living in this region and are facing these threats to their lives and their dignity. And I hope and I pray that we will continue to think about these values and ideas, to be partners with Israelis in thinking through these dilemmas and just trying our best to live up to the spirit, the codes of the IDF, and the legacy of our tradition. But thank you. I know I went a few minutes over. I'm going to stop there and just wish you all health, safety. May we all, God willing, be able to go back to Israel soon in safety and be together as a Jewish people. And I'll end there. Thank you,
Thank
Alex.
you so much, Rabbi Lauren Berkun. And thank you all for being here this evening to learn difficult Torah that unfortunately is relevant, but thank God we get to learn it. What a beautiful thing it is when the Jewish people come to learn Torah. Have a good night, everybody. Get home safe.
Thank you, guys. Have a good night.